Today's project is inspired by this Peacock Collage fabric sample. I began by mixing some turquoise primo with a little bit of white just to lighten it, and then rolled it to a 3 on my Atlas machine. I'm using the Floral Extravaganza silkscreen from CreateAlong to screen my pattern. You want to place your silkscreen with the brighter colored side, the darker side, face down against your clay sheet. I like to roll over it a bit just to make sure it's going to stay in place before I start to silkscreen. I'm using a slightly darker shade of turquoise, in this case it's DecoArt's Desert Turquoise, to silkscreen the image. Gently lift and remove your silkscreen. Be sure to wash your silkscreen immediately so that the paint doesn't dry in the open areas. And I'm going to let the paint dry on the surface of the slab also. The next layer of images is going to come from my Cindy's Peacock silkscreen. This is also from CreateAlong, and I'm using the round one that has a feather paisley in it. It's a little harder to make it stay in place because of the already silkscreened image, so I'm going to hold it, and I'm using some black acrylic paint. I'm going to continue adding these randomly over the surface and then wash the silkscreen right away and let this paint dry. The next layer of pattern, I'm using a sort of lemon-shaped cutter to actually paint stamp the images onto the slab to mimic one of the patterns found in the original fabric. I'm just going to use the end of one of my applicators to add the little dot details in the centers of each of these outlines. Next, I'm using some more of that mixed clay and the turquoise and white, and I rolled it to a 5 on my clay machine. And I am using the Paisley Field silkscreen from CreateAlong and some white acrylic paint to silkscreen. I'm going to wash the silkscreen again right away and let the paint dry on the surface of the clay. Now that the paint is dry, I'm going to use a paisley cutter to cut several paisleys from this piece. If you don't have the paisley cutter, you can use a drop cutter and curve the top of it, or you can use a craft knife and hand cut some paisleys. Set them aside for now after you're done cutting them. For the next layer of the design, I am using some orange acrylic paint and a sponge dauber, and I'm going to make some sponged paint circles on the surface. This is going to be the base of the orange, yellow, and green flower embellishments that are on the original fabric. The next step is to roll some Sunshine Yellow Primo to a 7 on the Atlas machine. You want a thin sheet for this. And I'm using a deco disc from CreateAlong to texture it. When you're using deco discs, you want to use a release agent. I like to use water, but you can also use mica powder or cornstarch. And I'm just going to press the center of it into the clay sheet and do this a few times because I want that center image for my flowers. You can use any deco disc from your collection for this. Once I have my images, I am coming back with a small floral cutter, just a small basic flower, and I'm going to cut out the flowers from the centers of the patterns. Over the orange dots on the clay sheet. . For the next layer on these flowers, I'm using pistachio souffle, and I'm going to use one of my etch and pearl tools. So I have rolled it out fairly thick. I believe this was a 1 on my clay machine, and I'm going to use the etch and pearl tool to apply some pearls in a circle around to create the inner flowers. To flatten the pearls, I'm using a small sphere tool, ball tool, and I'm just pressing into each of those pearls to flatten them. Next, I'm going to use that same Cindy's Peacock screen and screen some peacocks with the black paint here and there. I added 3 of them, one of them extending off of the slab. Again, using that original fabric as inspiration on where I placed things, and considering the overall pattern that I have so far, I went back and added the paisleys to the surface. I rolled some pomegranate red Primo to a 7 on my Atlas machine, and I'm using this stencil from the May Flowers selection at CreateAlong. It happens to perfectly match one of the flowers in that original fabric, and I'm using some pale yellow paint to stencil the flowers onto the clay. Once the paint was dry, I used a craft knife to cut around the individual flower petals and then place the flowers onto the slab that we're creating. I chose to let some of them overlap some of the orange and yellow flowers like they do in the original fabric. Now it's time to add those rings of dots, and to do that I'm using some orange Primo, again rolled to a setting 1, and the etch and pearl tool, and I began to make my rings here and there on the surface. I made 2 rings with the different dots aligned for each of the orange clay dot rings. For the innermost ring, I'm using some orange acrylic paint and the tip of my etch and pearl tool to just paint stamp basically those tiny dots in the centers, again aligned with the outer dots. I then repeated the entire process with some white Primo and white acrylic paint. For the last pearled details, instead of the orange, I'm using some of the pistachio green, and I'm just using paint. This is actually Inchworm Deco Art Americana, and it matches the pistachio clay almost exactly. And I've gone back to the back of my applicator tool to make these sort of curved rows of dots. I'm starting with a few of those, and then I'm going to come back with the tip of the Etch and Pearl tool and add a few more extending to make those swirls. And the last step, again mimicking the original fabric, is to add a little touch of shimmering gold to the tail feathers on the peacocks. And to do that, I'm just using one of these tiny applicators from CreateAlong and some gold mica powder, which I also got from CreateAlong. Just add touches of it to those tips of the tail feathers. I'm Cindi McGee, and I hope you enjoyed this pattern to polymer tutorial. I think I'm going to make polymer trading coins or perhaps some jewelry with my slab, and I can't wait to see what you create with yours. Lots more amazing polymer clay videos here on Polymer Clay TV, and share your projects in our Polymer Clay Tribe Facebook group.